I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute here at Washington State University. And on behalf of the Institute and on behalf of the Business of College and on behalf of the League of Women Voters, I want to welcome you out to our event this evening. I'll just warn you that apparently there was some miscommunication in the advertising at the Business College, and they thought this event was starting at 7 o'clock, so we may have a lot of them coming in at 7 o'clock. So don't be alarmed if that happens. It's actually this is our third annual business policy symposium that we've held in connection with the Business College. And the topic tonight really couldn't be any more timely. The role of super PACs and the impact of Citizens United on our campaign finance system in the United States is, as you all know, I hope, quite current in the news. And I suspect it's important both in terms of politics and in terms of businesses. My guess is there's a lot of conversations taking place in boardrooms across the country this election cycle. And for the first time, they're not talking about how much can we spend and what are the legal limitations on our spending, but how much should we spend? Because now they can spend virtually unlimited amounts of money. I also suspect there's a lot of people in politics who were very much in favor of Citizens United in theory, but now that they see it in practice, like Newt Gingrich, he may not be quite so enthusiastic about the impact of Citizens United and the way it will change our elections. In any case, we have a very distinguished panel this evening, and it should be a very lively discussion. We've asked each of the panelists to take 10 to 15 minutes to lay out their positions, and then after that we will open it up for some question and answers from the audience. We'll begin. I think we'll go straight down in the order that our guests are seated. I'll introduce each one of them as they come up to speak. Our first speaker is Melanie Sloan, and she is the Executive Director of Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. She's also a nationally recognized expert on congressional ethics. Prior to starting CREW, she served as an assistant U.S. attorney in Washington, D.C. Ms. Sloan received her BA and her JD from the University of Chicago, and she has authored numerous articles and law reviews. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Sloan.
Thank you. Either one. I'm going to say seated. There you go, because you have the thing. Yeah. It's okay if I sit there?
That's fine.
Thank you all for coming, and I'm honored to be in such illustrative company today. And I also want to extend a particular congratulations to Congressman Baird, who has been a leader on congressional ethics issues and, in fact, had sponsored something called the Stock Act, which just passed the Senate today. And so maybe later he'll have a chance to tell you a few words about that, because it's a big victory for congressional ethics. But tonight we're here to talk about another ethics issue, really. It's Citizens United and the nearly limitless amount of money that is now flooding into our political system. I think you're going to hear some different views from everybody about whether that's good or not, but in my view, this is just purely bad. There is actually nothing redeeming about Citizens United. For those of you who don't know exactly what Citizens United is, this is a case that came out 2 years ago in which the Supreme Court held that the prohibition of all independent expenditures by corporations and unions was invalid. And when I say independent expenditures, I mean running ads that were directly advocating the election or defeat of a specific candidate. This opinion was authored by Justice Kennedy, who wrote, "If the First Amendment has any force, it prohibits Congress from fining or jailing citizens or associations of citizens for simply engaging in political speech." The court overruled a fairly recent decision called Austin versus Michigan Chamber of Commerce, which had previously upheld a Michigan Campaign Finance Act that prohibited corporations from using Treasury funds to support or oppose candidates. The court also overruled another case, McConnell versus Federal Election Commission, at least in part, to effectively remove the limits on the amount corporations and unions could spend on electioneering communications. Kennedy concluded that independent expenditures do not lead to or create the appearance of quid pro quo corruption, and that there's only scant evidence that independent expenditures even ingratiate. Well, that's a remarkable thing for him to say, and it was particularly remarkable in light of an earlier case the same year in which Justice Kennedy had also authored the opinion, and that one was called Caperton versus Massey. In that case, the court held that a West Virginia Supreme Court who'd failed to recuse himself from a case involving a CEO who had spent nearly $3 million on independent expenditures in support of that judge's judicial election was in fact invalid. He said the judge should have recused himself. And this was because the independent expenditures had constituted the vast majority of the spending in that judicial election. Justice Kennedy had written, "No man is allowed to be a judge in his own cause, and similar fears of bias can arise when a man chooses the judge in his own cause." So it's hard to understand how he could, at the one hand, say there's $3 million in independent expenditures on a judicial election can create a bias, but that there's no evidence that independent expenditures in congressional or federal elections can cause the same kind of corruption issues. So now let's look at how it's turned out. This case has actually had a staggering impact. According to the Center for Responsive Politics, the amount of outside spending for ads and other purposes in the current election cycle is nearly double of what had been spent at the same point in the last presidential cycle, 2008. As of January 24th, $44.6 million had been spent by outside groups. And at the same point in 2008, the figure was $23 million. And in 2010, it was $21 million. Independent expenditures, including spending by presidential super PACs, accounts for almost all of this money, 95% of it. Only a little over half, or 12.9 million of what had been spent at this point in the 2008 presidential cycle was attributed to the same kind of independent expenditures. And almost as striking is who's actually doing all this spending. So far, outside spending by Republican-leaning groups has come to $37.8 million, while that of Democratic-leaning organizations is just $6.6 million. But of course, in part, that's because right now we're in the Republican presidential primary. You can expect Democratic spending to increase in the general. All of this money has made a huge difference, and there is no better example of this than Newt Gingrich. Mr. Gingrich would not even be a candidate any longer if it were not for super PACs. He has raised very little money in public support. In fact, the only real money that he's raised is in two $5 million checks to his super PAC, Winning Our Future, and they're both from the same family, the Adelson family. Sheldon Adelson gave $5 million, and then his wife Miriam gave another $5 million. This money has really allowed Gingrich to stay in the race. So previously, a candidate's ability to stay in the race was based in part on his ability to raise funds and convince a wide swath of people that he was a viable candidate. And in fact, it was that viability that kept him in the race. But now all you need is your own billionaire, and you can be in the race indefinitely, and perhaps at some point you could even buy a presidency. Further, because Mr. Gingrich's actual campaign has so little money, his super PAC has become, in effect, a shadow campaign. It has started to engage in get-out-the-vote kinds of efforts and phone banks because his candidacy, his campaign committee, can't afford to do it. Of course, still, the money that Gingrich is spending is dwarfed by the amount of money that Mr. Romney is spending. His super PAC is called Restore Our Future, and it's easy to see why you could confuse Restore Our Future and Winning Our Future. All the super PACs have names that are almost identical and meaningless. Restore Our Future has spent, as of January 31st, he had spent $17.5 million on ads, $16.7 million of which went to negative ads, by the way. And Winning Our Future, by contrast, had spent only $8.8 million, 3.5 went to negative ads, and 5.3 went to positive ads. 5.3 million on positive ads is somewhat unusual, but if you will recall, Mr. Gingrich at the beginning of the race said he was only going to be positive. But then when the relentlessly negative Romney ads were having a big impact, he changed his tune and he too started running negative ads. Over $14 million was spent in South Carolina alone, and $21 million was spent in Florida, and that's all just by super PAC spending. And another big issue you'll see with the super PACs is they're forbidden from coordinating with the candidates. But what does that really mean? Super PACs supporting Romney and Gingrich and President Obama are all run by close associates of those people. The person who runs Romney's campaign, super PAC ran his presidential campaign in 2008. Mr. Obama's super PAC is run by a former press aide. Mr. Gingrich's super PAC is run by one of his closest longtime aides. So these super PACs allegedly can't coordinate with the campaigns, but then we saw Mr. Romney, for example, go to an event that Restore Our Future held, And it was only after Mr. Romney appeared and spoke, and he then left the premises, and then the super PAC asked for money. So it's hard to imagine how that's actually not considered coordinating. Both Mr. Gingrich and Mr. Romney have insisted they have absolutely no control over the ads that their super PACs have run, and therefore they can disavow all the negative things said in those ads. But at the same time, both of them also have parroted exactly the statements in those ads later on the stump. So then you should wonder, well, isn't there anybody out there who should be regulating this? Is there anybody doing anything? And there is somebody who's supposed to be. In fact, there are 6 somebodies, and they're called the Federal Election Commission. The Federal Election Commission is what John McCain likes to call the little agency that can't. It's probably the least effective agency in Washington. The Federal Election Commission, its main problem is that it is 6 commissioners split on party lines 3-3. Well, what do you suppose happens when it's 3-3? You need 4 votes to get anything done, and they split 3-3 on nearly everything. In addition, 2 of the people who are on the commission have flagrantly disavowed campaign finance laws. They've said that one of them, who used to be Tom DeLay's campaign finance lawyer, has said specifically that he believes his job is to help Republicans and that he doesn't believe in campaign finance laws. So why is somebody like that sitting on the commission? Well, you particularly have to wonder why that person's sitting on the commission when 5 of the 6 commissioners are sitting despite expired terms. President Obama actually has it within his power to nominate new commissioners. Now, they'd be subject to Senate confirmation, and looking at what the Senate has, how many people they've been refusing to confirm, obviously this would be a fight. But this seems to me that it's a fight worth having, especially when President Obama routinely talks about the problems of Citizens United. He said he campaigned as a campaign finance reformer. He's been unhappy with Congress for not passing something called the Disclose Act. And yet, here it is, Mr. Obama has a position where he could take some action to enforce campaign finance laws, and he's sitting it out. And potentially he's doing that because he knows that he, too, is benefiting from the wild, wild west of campaign finance law. There was at one point an effort to have the FEC push in more disclosure rules. So one of the things that Citizens United held was, although they were going to allow all this spending and they were going to allow corporations and unions to engage in all this spending, they did say that disclosure of who was spending the money would be sufficient, and that should help deal with the corruption problems. But the FEC hasn't gone ahead and really required the same amount of disclosure. I'm sure you're all familiar with the kind of campaign ads you see where it says, "I'm Barack Obama and I approve this ad." Well, what you're seeing now is you'll see a campaign ad that says Restore Our Future is behind this ad. But what you don't know is who's actually behind Restore Our Future. And there was an effort in a rulemaking proceeding to have the FEC require anybody who'd given at least $1,000 to creation of an ad be listed on the ad. But the FEC refused to do that, only requiring disclosure of specific people's names if they gave money just for the specific purpose of that ad. So all somebody would have to say is, I give you this money, and they don't say, I give you this money to run this particular ad against Newt Gingrich, and there you go, you don't have to disclose it. So how is this all going to work out for all of us? Well, in the 2010 election cycle, the Chamber of Commerce spent more than $30 million on electioneering communications and didn't disclose its donors. Big corporations are giving to the Chamber of Commerce all the time, and we have no idea who they are. And the Chamber of Commerce has planned and promised to spend even more money in this election. Similar organizations, like the American Action Network, spent more than $20 million and didn't disclose. The FEC is refusing to deal with the fact that it created these loopholes, and everything obviously will be much worse in a 2012 presidential when we're looking at the first billion-dollar election. So then you have to see, what can we do? Is it just such a dire situation? And it is looking bad, I have to tell you. But by the same token, I think there are things that we as citizens can do about this. First, we can push the president to, in fact, do something about the FEC. There's a petition that we have with the White House. The White House has a system whereby if you get 25,000 signatures on a petition, they will agree to respond, and so Crew and a bunch of other good government groups have worked on this petition to say the president should respond to why he's not appointing new FEC commissioners. You can push your members of Congress to push for campaign finance legislation. There was a bill that failed in the last Congress, and that bill has been reintroduced by Congressman Chris Van Hollen. It's clearly not moving anywhere this Congress, but I think as the situation gets more and more dismal, more and more members of Congress being being upset by the ads that are going to be run against them may find themselves more inclined to vote for this, and we need to push for that. So I think it's a pretty bad situation for this year, but I think one of the things that you also really can do is focus on the negative ads you're seeing and recognize that they're not true. Most of what's said in those ads, you should check out on a site like PolitiFact and look to see how much of it is true. Don't just believe what you're hearing on TV and hearing on the radio, because these are ads run by people and corporations that we are unaware of their motivations, and you need to take that into consideration when you watch them. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Franz, excuse me. Michael is an associate professor at Bowdoin College. He received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin, and his research interests include political advertising, campaigns, and the role of media in politics. Dr. Franz's work has been widely published in leading political science journals. I will add much of it co-authored with my colleague in political science, Travis Ridout. He is also the recipient of the prestigious E.E. Schatzschneider Award from the American Political Science Association for research on American government. Professor Franz.
Thank you. Franz, Bowdoin, and Schatzschneider are a lot to pronounce correctly, so she did a good job. It's good to be here. I'm a political scientist, and so I can't really do anything without overhead slides, so I'm going to put up my PowerPoint. And can everyone see that okay? Okay, I'm going to take that as a yes. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about the role that Citizens United has had on political parties. And we can talk a lot about the role of Citizens United on advertising and on voters, and these are all excellent questions and things to be potentially concerned about. But political scientists are really, really passionate about the role of parties in our electoral process, and whether or not more influence for parties or less influence for parties is a good way to think about American elections. And this decision and the role of interest groups has really put pressure on parties in recent years in ways that we can see quite clearly. A couple of recent headlines that have focused on the impact of Citizens United and the rise of super PACs have emphasized these sorts of things. As parties fade and candidates shrug, super PACs drive campaigns, said one ad, or one story. Super PACs giving party committees a run for their money. Super PAC takeover, not so fast, campaigns say and hope. And then super PACs could change the historic winnowing pattern, which is what Melanie was talking about in terms of the Newt Gingrich side. It could alter, in fact, the way in which presidential candidates stay in the race. And so party committees are really sort of up against the wall here in terms of super PACs because they're playing a prominent role. But this wasn't always the case. And in fact, parties were in a pretty different position just a dozen or so years ago. A friend of mine, Dave Parker, who teaches at Montana State University, wrote a book a couple years ago called The Power of Money in Congressional Elections. And he puts in his book this graph. And what this graph shows is the amount of money spent in federal elections by parties as a percent of all money spent by candidates and parties between 1980 and 2000. And he documents this trend of an increase of party expenditures in federal elections that he doesn't think is either good or bad, but he thinks is particularly interesting because parties were reasserting themselves into the federal electoral process in the mid-1990s with things like soft money and other sorts of avenues of influence. And this was a stark difference from the role of parties in the 80s, who didn't really contribute much to candidates and were barred from certain types of activities and were very limited in what they could do to help their own candidates. And so the trend line here ends in 2000. And in 2002, McCain-Feingold passes in a major campaign finance reform that takes away from the parties their ability to raise and spend unregulated funds. And some people said, well, this was going to do damage to the party process because they were no longer able to sort of compete, perhaps. But parties seemingly, if we look at these numbers here, adapted quite well. The bar, or at least the figures on the left, party coordinated expenditures, are a traditional form for parties to help candidates, spending money to work with federal candidates up to a certain limit in House, Senate, and presidential elections. And parties have done that for the last 30 years, and they haven't done it any more or less generally over this time period, but they're limited in how much they can do in that regard. For a while, parties were actually banned from spending any independent expenditures of the kind that Melanie noted to help candidates, because the perception was by the courts or by Congress that there was really no way for the parties and the candidates that ran under a party label to work independently. And so the parties were prevented from spending such funds until 1996. But they really didn't spend any of that or spend on that regard, because for much of the 90s, parties took advantage of soft money, which was supposedly money to be able to be used by parties to get out the vote or to spread a party brand, but was oftentimes instead used to air ads for candidates that just didn't tell you how to vote, but told you that candidate X or so was really, really great. Well, that was banned with 2002, and parties adapted by simply raising more hard money and spending more of that, that's the red numbers there, on independent expenditures. And so if my friend Dave Parker were to continue the graph into 2010, one would expect that the party influencing campaigns would remain somewhat constant or maybe gone up because, hey, they adapted pretty well. But at the same time that this was happening, interest groups were also taking advantage of a variety of opportunities for them. And they were also coming to spend more money. And so I'm going to show you a bunch of numbers again. And the first set of numbers on the left are PAC candidate contributions, which allow some interest groups to contribute to campaigns. And they've been doing that for a long time. And they've been increasing the presence at which they do that for a number of years. And that hasn't been changed at all by any of these recent decisions. To the point in 2010 where they contributed about $500 million to candidates. But interest groups also do a lot of things outside of candidate contributions to help candidates that they like. The independent expenditures have been allowed for PACs and some other groups for a while, but they didn't spend much on that for the time period between 80 and the mid-90s, early 2000s, because they took advantage of their own loopholes in the late 90s to air what were called issue ads, basically ads that did the same thing, didn't tell you how to vote, but said that candidate X was really great or really bad. And the numbers all the way on the right are some limited data on how much that was done. But then the FEC mandated that we really track that starting in 2004. And as you can see, in 2004, the big Swift boat year, groups spent about $80 million advocating for candidates without actually telling you how to vote. And they spent an additional $68 million, almost $69 million, airing ads telling you how to vote. And they did that in 2004 and 2006, wasn't so bad, but 2008 and 2010 were really huge. And in 2008, groups took advantage of other Supreme Court decisions that allowed them to spend more money, and in 2010 was the first Citizens United election. And so by the time we hit to 2010, you see $208 million in independent expenditures and an additional $69 million in electioneering communications. Now, just to give you a scale of that effect, don't add them in your head, actually, just imagine you could add them. 208 plus 69 is a lot of money, and it accounts for much more than half of the PAC candidate contribution. But if you look at, say, 1982, $5.9 million in independent expenditures, but $87 million in PAC candidate contributions. And so for most of the time frame prior to the last few years, interest groups were much more interested in contributing to candidates, and that being it. But in the last few years, they've been much more interested and have increased their presence in advocating for candidates independently. And so now parties have to compete with that. And so if we were to extend the trend line out from 2000 in that graph I'd show you earlier, it's actually quite striking. I don't know if you can see the gray line there, but the gray line at the bottom is the interest group percentage, and the dark line is the party percentage. And so the parties reached their height in 2002, and despite raising lots of money for independent expenditures in the elections since then, have actually accounted for a smaller and smaller share of the role of electioneering in federal elections, as interest groups account for a greater and greater share. Such that in 2010, interest groups actually spent a greater amount of money advocating for candidates than the political party committees did. It's the first time in the entire time series that we see such a thing. And for many of these years, the gap was quite stark. And I gather that in 2012, that number is going to get even more different, and we'll see interest groups extending even farther above parties, but that remains to be seen. Now, to give you a sense of how this looks on the election-by-election scale, here is a graph that shows the amount of money spent or the amount of ads aired by political party committees in Senate races on the x-axis, and the amount of ads aired by interest groups in Senate races between 2000 and 2006. And the fitted line there is a regression line, and the slope tells us that how many ads interest groups aired under a certain number of ads that parties aired. And it tells us that for every 100 ads that parties aired in this time frame, interest groups invested about 16 ads in a different Senate race. But if we add 2008 and 2010 to the graph, we see that interest groups are accounting for a larger share of advertising than they have in years past, such that for every 100 ads aired by parties in Senate races, interest groups are now airing 52. And so they're accounting for a much bigger share of the role of what voters are seeing on TV, and they're playing a more dominant role than they ever have in sort of setting the issue agenda. We can do this for House races, and you see something similar between 2000 and 2008. 100 ads from parties produce 15 ads from groups. That's up to 40 ads in 2010. And so interest groups are a lot more dominant in the electoral system in terms of what voters are seeing and how voters are encountering campaigns. Now, this has entered the presidential primary system, as was noted. In all of the primaries between 2000, 2004, and 2008, interest groups spent somewhere between or about 5% of all the ads aired in the primary phase of these campaigns, 2000, 2004, and 2008. Just as of the end of January in this presidential election, interest groups, super PACs, have accounted for 44% of all the ads aired in the presidential race. So from 2000 to 2008, 5% at best, 4% at best, to 44%, an incredible increase. And so now, I haven't said whether or not this is good or bad, but I sort of believe that it's not great. And one of the reasons why, from a purely political science perspective, is that for a long time, political scientists have debated whether or not candidates should be the center of our electoral system. And many citizens believe this. I vote the candidate, not the party, for example, is a common mantra. But others assert that parties should be the center of the system. And parties should be the center of the system because, well, they're relatively durable institutions. Democratic Party's been around for a couple hundred years. And they're the only institutions in American politics whose single goal is to convince a majority of people that they have the best policies for America. Compare that to super PACs, which don't really care about perhaps a majority of the American people, but happen to be Newt Gingrich's best friend. And so for purely a simple comparison perspective, a party-centered system or a candidate-centered system is probably better than an interest group-centered system, but we are fast moving towards an interest group-centered system. And this might be something that we should be concerned about. Interest groups who don't have an incredible amount of accountability to the American people could be driving the issue debates in a campaign, could be making campaigns more negative, could be focusing more on personal character traits than policy issues. We don't know yet, but it's likely that they could have that kind of impact. So, what reforms should happen in that regard? And I've segmented this into the should happen and the are possible because they're very different given the current context. What reforms should happen, I believe, should be reforms that give candidates or parties some purchase back over the campaigns. Now that could mean moving in a deregulatory trend. Jim Bopp, who's one of the lawyers in this area who wants to get rid of everything, has said, even despite helping to create super PACs, well, poor candidates, let's give them the ability to raise millions of dollars from millionaires. Fits right into his playbook, in fact. But that would be one way to give candidates more primacy, would be to get rid of the shell game here of having the money laundered through super PACs. But if we wanted instead to sort of stay in the regulatory realm, we could do a variety of things in terms of should happen, like public funding, for example, giving candidates funds to compete with super PACs in terms of setting the agenda, free television time, and other opportunities to give candidates more chance to compete with super PACs in setting the issue agenda. All of these are interesting possibilities. Unlikely, but interesting possibilities. One reform that might be possible, and that I'm tinkering with, and I'm happy to be convinced otherwise, is to give parties more opportunity to coordinate with their candidates. This is an advantage that parties have already, but it's limited. In House races and Senate races, it's capped, and it's capped at a fairly low rate, pretty low given the cost it takes to run for office. And parties are actually pretty good at perhaps coordinating with their candidates over issue messages, sharing expertise and polling and information. And maybe we should allow parties more opportunity to do that without those caps, and instead then provide the incentive for donors to invest in the party system because that money could be spent more efficiently with candidates, than investing in these shell organizations. That would seemingly be a bipartisan reform, although I'm not privy to the internal politics of that, because both sides would probably like to help their candidates a bit more. So in the end, the larger message here is, I think, a message about the role that groups are playing in setting the issue agenda, to getting more prominent, and I don't necessarily think you'd find many political scientists or democratic theorists who would argue that, from an a priori perspective, that's best. So I'll stop there, and happy to take your questions afterwards.
Our third speaker is Brian Baird, who served in the U.S. Congress representing Washington's 3rd Congressional District from 1999 to 2011. Dr. Baird received his PhD in psychology from the University of Wyoming, and he is the former chair of the Department of Psychology at Pacific Lutheran University. He is the author of numerous publications. His most recent book is entitled Character, Politics, and Responsibility, Restarting the Heart of the American Republic.
It depends on how you like the book. Well, thank you for letting me join you today. Thanks to the Foley Institute and to Washington State University and the League of Women Voters. It's such an honor to be involved in anything associated with Tom Foley, one of the great statesmen of recent era in government and from our state. A really decent, wonderful human being. And we were privileged to have him as our speaker and as our representative for many years from here. Deservedly applause for Tom. He really is a great guy. And what I'll try to do is share with you the impact of this as a human being who had the privilege and responsibility of serving in Congress. And the first thing that strikes me about the numbers that we've been talking about, those are really big numbers. You know, you think about $400 million. You talk about $1 billion election, and you ask yourself, where could we have used that money instead in our society? And what we use it for, sadly, is so often ads that don't really inform and don't really enlighten and just are designed to sway people emotionally. I've been the target of many of these ads. I've had to raise a lot of money, and I want to share with you a little bit about the life of a member of Congress as it relates to money. If you decide you want to run for Congress today, you're embarking on a venture that most likely in a competitive race will cost a minimum of $2 million. For the House, if you're looking at Senate, you're talking 10 to 15 to, if you're in California, 50 to $100 million. Now, if you're a person of average means and you hear those numbers, you say to yourself, how could I possibly raise that money? Well, the answer is you spend much of your life making fundraising phone calls. You literally spend day after day after day. The euphemism in Congress is, and you'll enjoy this, is you're doing the Lord's work. I make that up not. If someone says, where are you going? And they say, I'm going to go do the Lord's work, it means you're going to beg people for money. And you will do that at the expense of time with your constituents. You will do that at the expense of time spent studying issues. You will do that at the expense of time spending time with your families. And you will be constantly aware of every vote you cast and the financial implications of that vote. When you're voting on bills, groups will do what's called scoring the bill. And this is everything from Sierra Club to the Chamber of Commerce, from Right to Life to pro-choice groups. And you'll have bills that are scored. And what that means is that they will send out a scorecard to their constituent groups, which is perfectly acceptable and part of informing the public, but it also often carries with it a financial consequence. If a bill is scored in a certain way, I was tempted, you know, we vote in Congress with little voting machines. You take a card with a computer chip on it, and you stick it in a slot, and you press the button. I was tempted to rig up one with a little tape recording so that if you press no or yes on a bill, it would go chking, 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 and even say that that'll cost you some money if you vote a certain way. Whether or not that's actually connected, which it isn't, to your vote, it is in fact connected to the financing. And one of the things we're seeing is now with the rise of the super PACs, the rise of pandering will in itself increase, as if there was not enough political pandering already. And the reason is that if you can curry favor with an incredibly wealthy donor, to some extent you can obviate a lot of those fundraising calls I just talked about. analyses of how much time members of Congress and candidates for Congress spend on fundraising has suggested we spend some weeks literally 20 or 30 hours a week or more raising money. My first term in Congress, I had, in quotes, the advantage of being on the West Coast, which meant that from 8:30 on, 5:30 West Coast time, I could dial for dollars till 11:30 at night. And I did, night after night after night after night after night after night, and so it went. And your merit as a candidate is evaluated not on your personal integrity or your character or your commitment to the country. It's evaluated oftentimes by how much cash on hand, COH, cash on hand. That's the metric against which you're measured. And your knowledge of the issues, your passion for the country, your compassion as a human being, your professional background, all secondary, virtually all secondary to cash on hand. So now imagine that you're spending night after night after night after night after night raising the money, and you've put together a pretty good campaign war chest. The analogies are interesting. It's a war chest. You're doing the Lord's work. This is jihad in some way. This is holy war, you know, raising money and running ads. And then at the end of all that work, somebody comes along, thanks to Citizen United, and decides they don't like you or they like somebody else, and in 30 seconds they write a check that obliterates all the work you've done for 2 years. 30 seconds, somebody writes a check, $2 million. They don't have to be in your district. They don't have to be able to vote for you. They don't have to, the ads they run may not be about the issues they're concerned about. They may actually care about this issue, but they're not going to run an ad on that. They're going to run an ad on whatever they think the polling says is your greatest vulnerability. 30 seconds, they write a check, wipe out all the contributions of all the individual donors in your district, wipe out all your time, and they may care about one single issue. And it may, by the way, be an issue that is so unique to them that is contrary to the interests of your constituents, may be contrary to the interests of the United States of America, may be contrary to a whole host of other issues, but it's their issue. And when they run this ad with all this money that Citizens United allows into the system, they distort the process. The awareness that that can happen discourages many good people from staying in office or running for office. Because you realize, I'm going to spend my whole life raising money, not doing the things I care about, not meeting constituents, not working on policy, not trying to make the changes the country needs. I'm going to spend it raising money, and at the end of the day, somebody I've never met is going to carpet bomb me with campaign funds of unlimited amounts and virtually anonymous source. And where does the money go? The money goes to this. Congressman Brian Baird says he cares about you, but I'm going to bet $5 million he doesn't. I was doorbelling one day, and I did a lot of that, even as a member of Congress, and I met with this lady, and she said, boy, you know, one thing I hate is all this negative advertising. I said, well, I'm with you on that. I in fact, if you look at my personal ads, I literally threw ads out if I thought they were unjustifiably negative in style or content, and I just threw them out, told the consultants, I'm not paying for this. Lady railed against negative advertising, and then she said, but you know, I'll tell you one thing. I'll tell you who I'm not going to vote for. And then she proceeded to list all of the characteristics that the negative advertising had said about the person. My predecessor, Don Bonker, tells the story of when he was running, and Don ran in the more genteel time. They started running negative ads about him, and his staff freaked out and said, Don, you gotta go up in the air and battle these negative ads. And Don said, look, people know me, they're not concerned about this, we're not gonna react, just calm down, I've been through these things before. Don happens to be stopping by his mom's house for dinner, and I'm sure he won't mind me telling this story. He stops by his mom's house, and his mom's unusually quiet. And he says, Mom, you seem to be troubled by something. And his mom says, Don, what's this I hear about you not telling the truth to the people? His own mom had been influenced by the negative ads. So if I could do one reform, and this is in my book, but literally, and I care passionately about the First Amendment, I die to protect it. But if I could make one single reform to improve our political system, it would be change how we fund campaigns. And what I would do is ban all independent or individual fundraising or campaign spending. I'd give a fixed amount. Any candidate who could reach a certain modicum of signatures, so they get to a certain level, that you just can't, be any crackpot out there. You have to be a crackpot with some support. And if you get a certain level, you get a fixed amount of time, and that's it. Because the pervasive and corrosive influence in every aspect, in the opportunity costs of how the money be better spent, in how we second guess our votes, in how we select people for office because of the money issue, and how it distorts the voting process on a host of issues, foreign policy being one I'm profoundly concerned about, but economic issues, et cetera. All of those things make our government less effective and less constructive and less productive than it should be. And I think the Citizens United decision was an exponential, multiple orders of magnitude negative impact on that. And I hope at some point we'll be able to overturn that.
Our final speaker this evening is Dr. David DeWolf. Dr. DeWolf is a professor of law at Gonzaga Law School in Spokane. He's a graduate of Stanford University and Yale Law School, and previously clerked on the Idaho Supreme Court. He is currently also a senior fellow at the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute in Seattle. Dr. DeWolf.
Thanks for inviting me here. It's been fascinating so far. I hope I can hold up my end of the bargain. I was invited not to bury Citizens United, but to praise it. And indeed, I'm very happy to do that. And let me start by describing what it is that the Supreme Court does when it is facing a case in which someone challenges the constitutionality of a statute like the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. Its job is to be an umpire between the contending parties here. It's the government on the one hand and an individual on the other hand, or an organization like Citizens United that complained its constitutional rights had been violated. And in upholding the constitutional balance here, the bargain, we know that the Constitution sets the boundaries for what the people authorize the government to do in forming the Constitution, in creating this national government. We recognize the potential for the government to exceed its powers and become tyrannical, as so many other governments had followed that trajectory. And so, again, the court has to look at what the Constitution set by way of a leash that would be imposed upon the government, and to hold on to that leash when it was being exceeded. In particular, I think the court is not empowered, authorized to decide what is best for the country, to promote important social interests. Those things might be relevant to determining the meaning or interpretation of a constitutional provision, but the fact that the outcome in Citizens United is bad for the country or is good for the country is a separate question from whether or not this is what the Constitution requires. So to do that, we go back and look at what was the First Amendment, what was its purpose. And again, the historical pattern is that governments tend to want to restrict what they think of as bad speech, speech that is destructive to society in general, or in particular to the interests of the governors. We have a First Amendment not because speech is harmless, because it doesn't hurt anybody and we ought to let people blather on because, after all, it makes them feel good and what harm is there. We know that speech is a form of action. Speech is powerful. The speech by which I enter into a marriage, or when the president declares war, or when a judge imposes a criminal sentence, or even when we enter into a contract, that speech that we make has long-lasting consequences. So it is not because speech can't be destructive that we permit it to be made freely, but rather because we fear something more than bad speech. We fear the the ability of the government to decide which speech is good and which speech is bad, when speech is needed and when we have too much of it. Or as we'll see in the dissenting opinion to Citizens United, when speech is disproportionate, when it has a distorting effect upon the political process. And again, I do not impugn the motives of the people who have voted for campaign finance reform or who defend it, but I would remind us of the statement that Justice Brandeis made in the Olmstead case, where he says, "Experience should teach us to be most on our guard to protect liberty when the government's purposes are beneficent. Men born to freedom are naturally alert to repel invasion of their liberty by evil-minded rulers. The greatest dangers to liberty lurk in insidious encroachment by men of zeal, well-meaning but without understanding." And again, without impugning the motives or the intelligence or the understanding of those who support these types of limitations, the concern that I have is that it works in a profoundly opposite direction. Again, what is the evil that the campaign finance laws were designed to avoid? We've heard about corruption, and that's sort of a separate issue. It's a somewhat metaphorical discussion of corruption. Corruption in the sense of giving a politician money so that the politician will do a particular thing. To bribe a politician is different from simply saying things that are supportive of the politician or saying things that are adverse to that politician's interests. The primary reason advanced for the particular provisions of Citizens United that were struck down was that this idea of anti-distortion, that the government had an interest in ensuring that disproportionate types of speech, that by people with lots of money, by corporations as distinguished from individuals, by groups of individuals as opposed to the individuals themselves, that this potential for distortion justified the limitations that would be placed on campaign, on electioneering statements. And again, what was prohibited in Citizens United was to air to make available on demand a video that was sharply critical of Hillary Clinton immediately prior to the primary election where it was supposed to be aired. So why is this anti-distortion rationale so much of a concern to those of us who support the Supreme Court majority's decision in Citizens United? Again, the First Amendment is not simply the protection of an individual's right against the pressures of the common good. If we think about some other areas, for example, environmental protection, I might like to fire up my charcoal barbecue and cook my meat outside, but gee, if everybody did that, it would have a deleterious effect on the environment. The balancing of the public good against the individual interest requires some sacrifice of the individual interest in order to protect the common good. But again, the First Amendment performs a different function. It serves as a firebreak between the state under a leash and the state that has become so pervasive that it controls all aspects of our lives. Again, the founders were well aware of the extent to which a state, once empowered to do all kinds of things, would usurp the rights and liberties of individuals and eventually absorb all powers to itself. And so, again, the First Amendment is to ensure that when there is this temptation on the part of government to shape and limit and control and modulate and balance political speech, this is a worrisome trend. Again, if we were to adopt the position taken by the dissent, we would, in effect, authorize the Federal Elections Commission to make the very detailed kinds of determinations about which groups are media corporations and which ones are not, when an individual's electioneering is likely to reach 50,000 people or more. All of the technicalities that look like the Internal Revenue Code would be grafted onto these provisions that the average person, even a group of people, would be faced with this daunting task of navigating through what is permitted and what is not permitted at the risk of incurring civil fines or even criminal punishment. There are a whole bunch of technicalities in the opinion. I'm very grateful for Melanie's giving you a clear kind of a summary of the general opinion, but there's all kinds of stuff in it, all sorts of distinctions that are drawn that we don't have time for. But I want to emphasize in my conclusion here that in looking at Citizens United, there are two different questions. One is the question, will this work to the benefit of the country? Maybe it will, maybe it won't. That's really different from the task of the Supreme Court. Their job is to call the balls and strikes of what the First Amendment permits and what it forbids. And for my money, I think the majority they got the call right in terms of what the First Amendment permits. But let's take it to another level. Let's look at a proposal for a constitutional amendment that would in effect overrule Citizens United and permit this regulation of speech to ensure that there's less distortion in the political process, to balance the scales of who's speaking and to make sure that people with lots of money don't outweigh the contributions of people of modest means. Giving the government that degree of authority, to me, is a really bad idea. It is lengthening this leash that the people have given their government to such an extent that it would work a major disservice to the ultimate authority that the people have over their government. And again, the very fact that these are well-intentioned doesn't save it from the potential that however well-intentioned, it works to the detriment of individual liberty. I want to stop there so that we have, I guess, about half an hour left now for comments from our other panelists and so forth. So go ahead.
Okay, I'd like to open it up for questions now. We have microphones located on either side. I'm going to ask you if you have a question, that you move to one of those microphones, and I'll just alternate back and forth as people start lining up. What I want to do is ask if any of the panelists want to comment on any of the remarks made by the other panelists, but I'm particularly interested if anyone would like to respond to Professor DeWolf's arguments about the Constitution and the fear of letting government have a role in prescribing what can be said in political speech.
Yes.
Funny you should ask.
So what I'm curious about, Professor, is before we had Citizens United, it didn't seem like the country was going to pot over when we had, McConnell versus Feingold was it the law, and when the Michigan case, Austin versus Michigan, I mean, it didn't seem like we had so many problems, and it seemed like the Supreme Court could have decided Citizens United on a much narrower ground, and in fact, I mean, they went out of their way to make a much more sweeping opinion, in fact, requiring rebriefing so that people could, so there would have been a way to deal with exactly Hillary the movie without going to these great lengths, and it also seems like they didn't deal with at all the in my view, the pretty big disconnect between this case and Caperton.
Oh, well, let me just respond to Caperton. Remember that Caperton is a case about a judge.
Right.
Where the judge is expected to be neutral. And campaign contributions for someone expected to be neutral, I think, is quite different from campaign contributions to a elected official.
But then you're saying the campaign contributions should be buying you. Like for Congress, it's okay, you can't buy your judge, but you can buy your congressman.
No, but I think the level of expectation that to some extent the political process is a matter of putting together coalitions, finding supporters, convincing your supporters that you are carrying the water for them. I think that's quite different from the role of a judge whose neutrality is the core of what they do.
Okay, how about the other part?
Oh, the other question is, were things so bad that the court, pulled the steering wheel just as we were about to go over the cliff? And the answer is no. But on the other hand, I think that goes to my point that the job of the court is not to look at the country, where do we need to go and let's steer it in this direction, but simply to say, what does the Constitution permit and what does it forbid? And in that respect, I think there are arguments about why Austin was wrong are, at least to me, persuasive.
There's an inherent danger in the Brandeis quote, because it implies that anybody else is well-intentioned but sadly misguided, but I, who make the quote, am not sadly misguided, and it's you who are going to overreach, but I'm defending neutrality. That doesn't fly to me, because each guy can say it about the other side, and I'm going to assume that you're well-intentioned, you assume I'm well-intentioned, but one guy implies that the other guy's well-intentioned and misguided. Look, the word party never appears in the Constitution of the United States, never appears. The dynamics of what was happening when that document was written are so much different than they are now. And on the one hand, it's fashionable on certain sides to say we have to, the Constitution exists to protect the people from an overreaching government. And I think, it's remarkable that one of the first things the first Congress did was pass the Bill of Rights. How many times in human history had a new government made as one of its first priorities to restrict its own powers? More power to that Congress that did that, and I hold the Bill of Rights to be an astonishing document. But that doesn't mean that we are not subject to risk from abuses by non-governmental entities. And therein lies the biggest concern of Citizen United. Now, the ultimate remedy, frankly, is not legislation. It's the individual public educating themselves better about the real issues and the real character of the people involved. That is the ultimate recourse of a constitutional democratic republic. But the reality is that when the public gets much of its information through a media source, predominantly still television, and wealth concentrated in a few hands can disproportionately shape the message that public hears, that is, I think, comparably pernicious and comparably threatening to our constitutional democratic republic as would an overreaching government. The key, I think, to the First Amendment is content. When I talk about a publicly funded campaign, I'm not saying in any way, shape, or form, nor would I ever condone, providing a threshold of support is met, would I ever condone the government saying, you cannot have money if you say certain things. Even if they're abhorrent and repugnant, if you've got enough base, you ought to have a certain amount of money to say it. It's the content that the government shouldn't constrain. But giving the resources to the large groups of people or to individuals to compete on a fair playing field makes sense to me as fair.
Okay. Anyone else want to jump in? Okay. I think we'll start over here with a young woman.
Yes. Would you say there's any strategy you could ever have without having a wealthy person or a business fund your campaign? Is there any way to just not deal with that? Or is this Citizens United decision only make it so that the only way to win is to have a corporation back your super PAC?
We had a pre-Citizens United example in this state. Former Governor Mike Lowry ran a campaign in which he accepted no contribution above $100. And I know people who worked on that campaign, and so many people, the fact that he's governor says it was successful. So many people started sending $100 checks that by the end of it, they were making their media buys based on the weight of the mailbag. Truly, that's how they'd estimate how much money they had. They did some sampling and said, well, if the bag weighs 20 pounds, we probably got X amount of money, we can buy X amount. And it resonated with the people. The challenge is that was pre-Citizen United. So you could have 4,000 pounds of $100 check-filled mail bags, and somebody else says, how much did the Lowry campaign take in today? Well, they took in 400 pounds of checks or whatever. Well, I can fix that. I'm going to write the check the other side. Now, he may still win because the public will see through the other side, and God bless him if they do, but the balance is thousands of $100 checks being balanced against one single wealthy check writer is a problem.
But not for the presidency, right?
Sorry?
You'd think you'd need a backing of that for presidents, a
It's-
presidential campaign.
You might not, but it's the expense of running a presidential campaign are astronomical. Just the travel expenses, staff expenses, and then these media campaigns are, when we're running just at a congressional level, we run $200,000 to $300,000 a week out the pipe at the end of the race. $200,000 to $300,000. It's disgusting, but that's small potatoes relative to Senate or President.
Thank you.
All right, over here.
I have 2 questions, if I can ask them both. The first is about Crew. In one of the debates, Rick Santorum said that Crew was a left-wing organization supported by George Soros, and I was just wondering what sort of dirt did you pull up on him to piss him off?
So Crew every year puts together a list of the most corrupt members of Congress. And Rick Santorum was on that list in 2006. And interestingly, Crew had its busiest web traffic day ever, the day after New Year's, and we were closed that day. So we weren't doing anything. But it turns out that Ron Paul supporters had found that Rick Santorum had been on our list in 2006, and the list is still available on our site. And so Paul had pulled it, and they had started pushing it out. And it was Ron Paul who was really, Republican and Libertarian Ron Paul, who was really confronting Santorum with those ethics issues, which I persist in believing are severe for Mr. Santorum. He is not the moral paragon he likes to appear. So it's interesting that the ethics stuff that we do, those kind of reports, can really haunt somebody years and years later. It is typical of somebody. I have yet to see anybody Crew has gone after ever say, "Wow, you got me. That's right. I did that. Oh my God, I shouldn't have. I'm sorry." They only say, you are either a left-wing front group, or you are, if it's a Democrat, we don't like conservative Democrats, or if it's a left-wing Democrat, we don't like progressive Democrats, or if it's an African-American Democrat, we don't like African-American Democrats. So there's always somebody we must not like, and it must never have anything to do with actually what they've done. And of course, using George Soros is it's the boogeyman the right likes to bring up, much like, the left has the Koch brothers. So that was supposed to just shut down the conversation. So that's that.
But you've actually gone after.
Lots of Democrats.
Crew's got after. You've looked at Maxine Waters and some others, right?
Many Democrats. In fact, right before the Santorum spectacle, we had the most recent Democrat we'd gone after was a member of Congress, a Democrat from New Jersey, who has misused his campaign funds to both go on a trip to Scotland with his family for a donor's wedding, and he held a high school graduation party / campaign fundraiser with his campaign funds.
Who was that?
Rob Andrews.
Ouch.
Yeah, not good.
And my second question was it Citizens United that said that corporations are people? And how can you consider a corporation a person when it doesn't have a soul?
Well, I do not consider corporations people, but I think our colleague down at the end may have a different view.
Well, there's a long history of the debate about what corporations are and what legal status they have and so forth. I think one of the areas that convinced the court not to draw this tight line between individuals and corporations is that, after all, individuals get together in order to maximize their effectiveness. They join with other people in nonprofit organizations that often take the corporate form. And for that matter, the difference between, I guess, Facebook is about to become, well, it's already a corporation, but now they're going to go public. And the rise from being an individual to being a corporation is a somewhat hazy line. Now, one of the things that convinced the court, the majority, not to buy this distinction between individuals and corporations as being decisive in whether they had First Amendment rights was the fact that media corporations were exempted from the scope of this act, and the difficulty of explaining how it is that, first of all, you would tell who's a media corporation and who's not, what status that would entail, and if in fact corporations had no rights, is it true that you could, if you wanted to, add media corporations to the list of people that had no rights? So again, the majority thought that the First Amendment not only limited the ability of Congress to squelch the rights of individuals, but in squelching the rights of corporations, they risked the very values of the contribution to the public debate that corporations provide.
Okay, we normally alternate, but since we're only on the left, I want to be nonpartisan. We'll stick to the left since that's all we have right now.
But by being on the left, I am being partisan, aren't I?
Yeah.
So as I've been listening to this conversation, I keep on, in my head, what keeps on rolling around is the concept of social capital. And I'm really interested in how you all feel about individual campaign contributions as a measurement of social capital, and if you're familiar with any data about how many American citizens, residents of America, actually contribute to candidates on either a federal, state, or local level.
Everyone looks to you.
The numbers guy.
Yeah. Well, in terms of the federal level, because that's probably the best uniform data that we have. It's a little hard to tell because if you don't give more than $200 to a candidate, you're not itemized in the campaign's reporting. So we don't know. But if you do look at the itemized contributors, the people that give more than $200, those numbers have gone up over the years, and it's about 1.5 million or 2 million people or something to that effect. It's not 300 million people or 50 million people giving more than $200 to candidates. And then if you add in parties who are unique party contributors, you might get some more. People that give to PACs because they work for a corporation that has a PAC, or they're part of a union that has a PAC, you can get a little bit more. But some of those people are also giving to candidates, and so it's a minority percentage of the American people for sure. And if you add in state candidates, you have to go into each state and kind of aggregate that all up, but you might add some more. But I think it's pretty safe to say that the vast majority of Americans don't give to campaigns. Now, I don't know if that's good or bad, but we used to have a tax credit. So if you gave $50 or something to a candidate, and you got a tax credit for that, and it was supposed to increase giving on behalf of campaigns, make it easier for candidates to raise money, I guess. But we got rid of that in the 80s. And probably nobody would ever consider bringing that back.
Can I just ask, what percentage of Americans vote? Because that's also, so.
Yeah. Well, it's pretty bad there too, but more people vote than contribute. Actually, we had the highest turnout rate in 2008 that we've had in presidential elections in a long time, 62% turnout, which was the highest since 1968. But even in the great election of 2010, the great GOP revolution election, turnout rates were 40% of eligible voters. So 6 in 10 eligible voters who could have voted did not. And so to me, that's incredibly appalling, and probably is to all of you as well. And to tout 62% as a win, in my class, that's a fail. But anyway, it has gone up from the low in 1996 when we had a turnout rate of just above 50% in a presidential election for eligible voters. So that even takes out people who are 18 or older who can't vote.
I think we'll stick over here.
Maybe anyone could answer this contradiction I'm seeing, in the sense that if it's okay before Citizens United for an individual to be limited to X number of dollars, I believe the term was hard money, why is it not the same now with corporations only limited to the same number of that an individual is? If corporation is a person, why is it not limited as a person was?
Well, corporations still can't make contributions at all to candidates directly. So there's still that, right? And it was and that's the hard money is the money that people give to candidates. Soft money is considered corporate money and union money from their treasuries. So corporations are still not allowed to do that. There are some cases going through where people are trying to get rid of the contribution limits and the ban on corporations making contributions directly to candidates as well.
So then, is it possible now for an individual, as well as the corporation, to give an unlimited amount of dollars after? So I guess I'm asking,
No, Citizens United didn't change the amount of money that anybody could give to a candidate directly. It only changed the money that could go into these independent expenditures.
Thank you.
Make one of the distinctions between how much you can give and how much you can spend. And one of the arguments in the decision, you have more expertise than I, but was the premise is if you give me something to my campaign, I register, okay, so-and-so gave me, they maxed out to my campaign, and I make the connection there. If you spend it independently, so goes the argument, well, that, and I just find this an astonishing thing. It could only be written by a judge who's never run for office. But if you spend it independently, I somehow think, oh, that was nice that someone spent money, but I don't know who they are, and I'll never do a favor for them, nor would I tailor my message to try to encourage them to donate. What? I mean, Adelson wrote the $5 million check to Gingrich Super PAC about a couple weeks after Gingrich said there was no such thing as the Palestinian people. So now we've got U.S. foreign policy pandering to political contributions that are coming in a big way. Both sides are guilty of that, but it's a significant challenge, and it's a myth to believe that there's no connection between what is spent independently and someone's position politically.
Okay, over here.
Mr. DeWolf, on the right, I think you mentioned kind of towards the end of your speech something about how Citizens United as a whole was kind of a two-part question, and how it kind of remained to be seen whether it was good or bad for America. And it kind of seemed to me like we went from a political system where we were advocating who was best for the position and we were going to vote for who was best for the position to more of like a popularity contest. And I guess my question is, and I guess this is for anyone to answer, is it ethical, Constitution aside, is it ethical as people to be advocating a system where you're pretty much saying, if I have more money than you do, you're going to lose, if that makes sense?
Well, let me just address part of the question, which is, again, what's the role of the court? If it's the 1880s and people think, gee, we need an income tax. Could you, as the Supreme Court, say, well, it doesn't really say this in the Constitution, but the country really needs it. Let's have an income tax. Or is that the function, as society changes and something is either needed or we recognize as a big danger, is that the role of amending the Constitution? If we decided we really needed the governor to be our next president, that Arnold Schwarzenegger, but unfortunately he wasn't a native-born citizen, so he's not qualified. Again, there are certain limitations that the Constitution places which may or may not be good for the country. It may be that a constitutional amendment should be adopted that would reverse Citizens United and permit these restrictions on campaign spending. But what I was trying to do was distinguish the question about will we be a better or worse people because the majority ruled this way from the question, well, what does the Constitution require?
Right. So would you say then that the question of Citizens United as a whole isn't an ethical question at all?
Well, I think the ethics of the judge in deciding a case is to try as best the judge can to call the balls and strikes without regard to, is this going to set a home run record, or is this going to, preserve the no-hitter for the pitcher? If it's a ball, it's a ball. If it's a strike, it's a strike. And to the extent that the rest of us have ethical responsibilities in the way we run campaigns or the way we vote or the way we support the political process, sure, we all have those ethical responsibilities, but I think the ethics of the judge in deciding the case is to be a little bit more removed from that.
And can I just add that money won't always carry the day. I mean, Meg Whitman didn't become the governor of California, even though she spent more money, and John Corzine on the Democratic side didn't become the governor of New Jersey, even though he spent more money. And I think in the end, there is actually no amount of money that could elect Newt Gingrich the president of the United States. But in more cases than not, it will have a huge impact.
The other thing that money does, two things. One, the other thing money does is it constrains the candidate pool. So even though Meg Whitman didn't win, the fact is if you're looking at entering a race and somebody can write the check and you can't write the check, it's a deterrent. I mean, the guy who can write the check can go out tomorrow, hire the best consultants, start running ads, and you're sitting there on the phone, I'm sorry, could you give $25 to my campaign? And the other guy's already got the $1 million campaign up. So it distorts the pool of candidates, I think, substantially more than we realize.
If I could add one bit of silver lining, which is that I think there is something to say about the nature of Citizens United that we could all take away from this, which is, lots of lobbying happens in Washington, and then citizens never see that. And so they don't necessarily know who's walking the halls of Congress or who's meeting with whom, and it's very difficult to sort of the average person to track that. And it's also very difficult after Citizens United to track who's paying for the ads. But at the end of the day, it's voters who get to decide whether they believe it or not. And I'm not an idealist, and maybe it's too much to expect, but if you don't know where the ad came from, just don't listen to it, right? And voters do get to keep that power even after Citizens United. And I would hope that people would take purchase over their own democratic responsibilities by saying, who's restore our future? And then not listen to it if you don't know it. And that, if that happens, then the decision itself and the amount of money that happens in a campaign, now who runs for office is another issue entirely, but the impact can be mitigated substantially if people took responsibility over how they made their decisions.
All right. Thank you.
Question for Professor DeWolf and perhaps others would like to chime in as well. I don't remember all the details of the Citizens case, but I remember reading some detailed analysis at the time that suggested that the Supreme Court, or at least Justice Roberts, was not a neutral party calling balls and strikes, that he took some affirmative actions to make sure that that case got before the court in a particular way, and then chose to find in a very, or argue to find in a very broad sense rather than a very narrow construction of the case. So can we honestly say that at least Justice Roberts was really a neutral balls and strikes umpire, or did he have perhaps a philosophical agenda behind his handling of the case?
Well, this is one of the technicalities of the case in the sense that the issue about the role of stare decisis, that is, previous precedents and whether you overrule them or whether you give them greater deference, and this question about judicial activism or judicial restraint. There's a lot of discussion on precisely this question of whether, and there's a lot of discussion within the case. In fact, there's a concurring opinion by Chief Justice Roberts defending the way in which the case grew into a much bigger decision than the narrow decision it might have been. So some of the parties were asking for a very narrow decision based upon the coverage of the statute as opposed to the big constitutional First Amendment issues. And this whole question about where the Supreme Court should be general in its rulings and when it should be narrow and specific, when it should respect previous precedent, when it should overrule previous precedent is an ongoing, long-standing debate. I would say that Justice Roberts staked out a position about the role of the court in terms of, what is called judicial activism or judicial restraint, in which he basically argues that he's taking the narrowest ground he can while still resolving the legitimate claims that Citizens United had brought. That what really was not possible to decide the case on any narrower grounds. Now, you may find his argument persuasive or not persuasive, but he certainly would bristle at the notion that he had in effect, used his power as the Chief Justice to kind of manipulate an outcome rather than trying as best he could to call the balls and strikes.
You know, your point is extremely well taken. The umpire analogy does not assume that the umpire was chosen by one side versus the other. The reality is Roberts was nominated by President Bush, and he was approved with some controversy, but on a promise of not being a judicial activist. And many of the people who are defending Citizens United were screaming about activist courts overruling decisions of the people's elected representatives, saying, how dare the Supreme Court tell my elected representative that what he or she wants to do is not constitutional? And now suddenly, basically, a legislated resolution to the campaign finance reform problem was overridden by a non-activist conservative judge who was far from a neutral umpire. And this will get much more interesting, by the way, because the next battleground of campaign spending is judicial elections. There are strategic plans in place right now, and it's already happening, to spend a huge amount of money going after people in judicial elections. So the idea that we're going to have judges who are independent, wise Solons, completely devoid of the political process is naive and anachronistic. And beyond that, we all know that much of the presidential debate at some level is about the Supreme Court and who the next president's going to nominate to the Supreme Court. And though they shouldn't, presidents make statements all the time about the who they'll nominate, either wink, wink, nod, nod, or explicit statements. So I think the analogy of the independent umpire choosing on the side of the Constitution versus the overreaching government is a bit strained.
Do you think Justice Roberts was being less than intellectually honest in his defense of all of that?
I think Justice Roberts, from the beginning of his confirmation, was less than intellectually honest.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
My question is directed at Dr. Franz. You mentioned one potential reform could be increased coordination between the parties and the individual candidates, and I was wondering what effects this might have on the democratic nature of the primary elections.
So on the primary process, it would functionally have no effect, because the parties don't really get involved in the financing, really, of the primary contests. I'm talking about it more from the perspective of providing an incentive for donors to see their dollars being spent efficiently. So you can give $1 million to a super PAC who can't coordinate and will, in fact, potentially duplicate services of a candidate. In fact, this is somewhat happening at the presidential level, where super PAC efforts are bumping into candidate efforts, and voters are getting kind of angry at getting 17 calls a day, some from super PACs and some from the candidates that the super PACs are supporting, that parties would be able to say that that money would not be duplicated or wasted, but spent in coordination with the campaign. And so if your money is going to be spent efficiently, give it to us. And there are already disclosure rules on the books for parties, and they have certain functional advantages as democratic institutions that sort of shadow super PACs don't have. And so my perspective from that is to think more about what's a possible tweak to the system that could shift the incentive game for certain donors. Whether it works the way I say it might is another question altogether.
The challenge you'd face is that parties do actually get involved in making decisions about primaries, and I think they might do more. I kind of liked the idea initially, but I thought about it more. And I don't necessarily personally get along super great with the current party chair. We've disagreed on some issues. And I would be concerned about a party saying, okay, we've got X amount of dollars and we're going to actually spend it. So I thought it was an intriguing idea. I still do. But I'd be worried about that sort of just big donor gives to party but says, but you party must not support somebody with who's out of our little narrow bounds, whatever that is, on the right or the left. We've already got parties that are pulling people too far to the sides, in my judgment, and the middle's getting lost, and I would worry about that possibly exacerbating, unless you had some balancing function.
Yeah, this is where the great challenge is in balancing out, where campaigns should be focused, sort of the candidate-centered version or the party-centered version. It's an interesting philosophical debate, and I would prefer to have that debate about role of candidates and parties interacting with one another, then and the value of that, then turning the keys over to the interest groups.
Yeah, good point.
This has been a terrific discussion. Unfortunately, I think our time is up. Before we thank our guests, I just want to mention that those of you who are interested in more information about the Foley Institute and receiving updates about our events, or those of you who may be here for a class, there are sign-up sheets out in the hall where you can sign your name and your email address. And now I also want to thank our co-sponsors tonight, the College of Business and the League of Women Voters. And on behalf of the Foley Institute and our co-sponsors, I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. I know there was a basketball game that you could have gone to as well. This is much more exciting and more interesting, I think. But now please join me in thanking our guests for a stimulating conversation.